For most people, the idea that a government could simply fail to pay its debts feels almost impossible. Governments issue the currencies we use, control vast resources, and have the power to tax entire populations. That kind of authority makes them appear financially indestructible. Yet history quietly tells a different story. Governments have defaulted on their debts again and again, sometimes suddenly, sometimes after years of warning signs. And when they do, the consequences ripple far beyond financial markets. Savings disappear, economies shrink, and entire societies are forced to rebuild trust from the ground up. The real lesson isn't just that governments can default, it's that they often follow the same predictable path before doing so. If you look closely at history, you'll notice patterns, warning signals that appear long before the collapse becomes obvious. Understanding those patterns doesn't just explain the past, it reveals how fragile financial systems can become when debt grows faster than a nation's ability to sustain it. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from 16th century Spain. At the time, Spain appeared to be the richest empire on earth. Gold and silver were pouring in from the Americas, filling the royal treasury and financing wars across Europe. King Philip II commanded one of the most powerful states in history, and his empire stretched across continents. From the outside, Spain looked unstoppable. But beneath the glittering wealth was a dangerous imbalance. The Spanish crown had borrowed heavily to fund military campaigns and maintain its vast empire. Much of the incoming silver from the New World had already been promised to bankers in advance. When military costs rose faster than expected and tax revenues fell short, the government found itself trapped. In 1557, Spain declared a suspension of payments to its creditors. It was, in effect, a default. This wasn't a one-time event. Spain defaulted multiple times over the next century. Each time creditors lost money, trade slowed, and confidence in the Spanish financial system weakened. What seemed like the richest empire in the world turned out to be dangerously dependent on borrowed funds. The illusion of endless wealth collapsed once lenders realized the empire's revenues could not support its debts. Centuries later, the same pattern appeared again in a very different place. In the 19th century, Argentina emerged as one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Its fertile land made it a major exporter of beef and grain, and European investors poured money into the country's railways, ports, and infrastructure. By the early 20th century, Argentina's income per person rivaled that of many European nations. Yet prosperity fueled a cycle of borrowing. Governments took on large debts to finance ambitious projects and maintain political support. When global commodity prices fell and economic growth slowed, the country struggled to service its obligations. Argentina defaulted on its sovereign debt multiple times during the 20th and early 21st centuries. Each default damaged the nation's credibility in global financial markets. Investors demanded higher interest rates, making borrowing even more expensive. The economy swung between periods of optimism and crisis, illustrating a brutal reality. Once a government gains a reputation for default, rebuilding trust can take decades. The 20th century offers an even more dramatic example in the aftermath of the First World War. Germany faced enormous financial pressure after the conflict, including heavy reparations payments demanded by the victorious Allied powers. To meet its obligations and domestic spending needs, the government began printing money at an extraordinary pace. At first, the policy seemed manageable, but inflation accelerated rapidly, eroding the value of the German mark. By 1923, prices were doubling in days. Workers were paid multiple times a day just to keep up with rising costs. Savings accumulated over lifetimes became nearly worthless. While this episode is usually remembered as hyperinflation rather than a formal default, the economic impact was similar. The government effectively destroyed the real value of its obligations by inflating the currency. Creditors were repaid in money that had lost most of its purchasing power. In practice, it was another way a government escaped its debts, by quietly transferring the loss to citizens and investors. More recently, the global financial crisis of 2008 exposed another vulnerability in government finances. Several European countries had accumulated massive debts during years of economic expansion. When the crisis hit and growth slowed, tax revenues collapsed while spending surged. Suddenly, the ability of some governments to repay their debts came into question. Greece became the most visible example. For years, the country had borrowed heavily while maintaining generous public spending. When investors realized the scale of the problem, confidence evaporated almost overnight. Borrowing costs skyrocketed, and the government was eventually forced into a massive debt restructuring in 2012. The consequences were severe. Greece entered a prolonged economic depression, unemployment soared, and public services faced deep cuts. The crisis demonstrated how quickly a government's financial position can deteriorate once trust disappears. Investors who had once been eager to lend suddenly demanded proof that repayment was even possible. What connects all these examples, Spain, Argentina, Germany, and Greece, is not geography or political ideology. It's a recurring pattern in how government debt evolves. The first stage usually begins with optimism. A country experiences growth or gains access to cheap credit. Borrowing seems manageable because the economy is expanding and interest rates are low. The second stage is complacency. Governments begin to assume that favorable conditions will continue indefinitely. Debt accumulates faster than the economy grows, but the risks are ignored because the system still appears stable. Politicians often delay difficult decisions, preferring short-term popularity over long-term discipline. The final stage arrives when confidence breaks. Investors start questioning whether the government can meet its obligations. Borrowing costs rise, making existing debt harder to manage. At that point, policymakers face a narrow set of choices: impose severe austerity, inflate the currency, or restructure the debt. None of those options are painless. Another important lesson from history is that defaults rarely occur in isolation. When a government fails to meet its obligations, the damage spreads through the financial system. Banks holding government bonds suffer losses, businesses lose access to credit, ordinary citizens face unemployment, inflation, or higher taxes as the government struggles to stabilize its finances. In many cases, the political consequences are just as dramatic as the economic ones. Financial crises often trigger changes in leadership, social unrest, and long-lasting shifts in policy. Governments that once seemed secure can lose legitimacy almost overnight when the public realizes the system was more fragile than it appeared. Yet despite centuries of examples, many societies continue to treat government debt as if it carries no real risk. The assumption persists that modern economies are too advanced, too sophisticated, or too interconnected to experience the same failures seen in the past. History repeatedly challenges that belief. The truth is that governments possess powerful tools to delay financial crises. They can raise taxes, cut spending, print money, or borrow from international institutions. These mechanisms can extend the timeline of a debt problem for years or even decades, but they cannot eliminate the underlying arithmetic. If debt grows faster than the economy that supports it, the imbalance eventually demands correction. This doesn't mean every government will default. Many countries manage their finances responsibly and maintain strong economic foundations, but the historical record makes one thing clear: sovereign default is not a rare anomaly. It is a recurring feature of financial history. For individuals and investors, the deeper lesson is about perception versus reality. Government bonds are often treated as the safest assets in the financial system. In many cases they are, but safety ultimately depends on the stability of the institutions behind them.